act worthy of yourselves. That was the message from Dr. Joseph Warren, one of the great heroes of the American Revolutionary War. That's what he urged the people to do when remembering the massacre in Boston, which was tomorrow in history, March 5th, 1770. And this was, if you're not familiar already, this was one of the most significant events that turned colonial sentiment against the British more generally and also cemented their opposition to standing armies particularly. Here's how Warren described things that they were facing in 1775. He painted a picture of what they once again faced some years later. He said, "Our streets are again filled with armed men. Our harbor is crowded with ships of war, but these cannot intimidate us. Our liberty must be preserved. It is far dearer than life." This is the great patriot again, Joseph Warren, Revolutionary War hero, who's telling us, like, liberty or death, really, is what he's saying here. And he goes on, he says, "We hold it even dear as our allegiance. We must defend it against the attacks of friends as well as enemies. Liberty is the primary object. Liberty is the goal, and our allegiance to no nation on earth should supplant our love of liberty," is really what he's getting to. And he's even saying we cannot even suffer the Britons to ravish it from us. And this was a speech given on what they used to call Massacre Day. They didn't call it the Boston Massacre. They referred to it as Massacre Day, and it was so important in the Boston area during the American Revolution, that is the run-up to the War for Independence, that it was commemorated as kind of a solemn public holiday in the area with speeches from prominent patriots. And in the last few years, I've been doing, I think I started 3 years ago, 4, maybe this is my 4th one now. I've been doing, it's kind of the same thing, commemorating the massacre in Boston, doing episodes highlighting one keynote speaker from each year. I did, the first one I think was John Hancock's speech from 1774. Then I followed up with Joseph Warren's first speech in 1772. He's the only one who actually gave 2 speeches. Then last year, I did Dr. Benjamin Church's speech from 1773, and that one was really interesting, and the speech was pretty awesome, but there's kind of a twist at the end. We'll link to all of these previous episodes. I've got one up on the screen here regarding John Hancock's speech. We'll link to these in the show notes, previous episodes on Massacre Day orations from these other patriot leaders, Sons of Liberty. Alan Mosley will get that organized, and I'll get the show notes published for this episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty in a couple hours after this live stream is done. But let's get to some highlights from Dr. Joseph Warren's second Massacre Day oration, or second speech, keynote speech, the only person to ever deliver it twice. This was on March 6th, 1775. The 5th was a Sunday that year, so they did not do this type of thing on Sundays, so they held the event the following day on Monday. And here from Aaron Shalev, I apologize for if I get the name wrong, Dr. Warren's Ciceronian Toga. Great article over at Commonplace. Again, all this stuff will be linked to in the show notes so you can read and learn more. He said, by the early spring of 1775, mind you, this is March, shot heard around the world is in April, war seemed inevitable. Warren thus staged his second massacre oration at a time when even the smallest spark would have inflamed revolutionary sentiments. And if the timing is any indication, the oration preceded the fateful Battle of Lexington and Concord by little more than a month. Warren's oration represented such a spark. And again from Aaron, he said, this day, the Boston Evening Post informed its readers on March 6, 1775, so it was published first thing early in the morning, and they distributed that out. They said, an oration will be delivered by Joseph Warren, Esquire, in commemoration of the bloody tragedy on the 5th of March, 1770. And Aaron writes that observant Bostonians recognized that this would not be just another commemorative address. They had started it in 1771, but it wasn't really organized at that point. There were actually 2 keynote speakers, and I forget which one of them, but one of them we don't even have the printout of the draft copy of the original speech. And then they really kind of organized it into a more formal event starting in 1772 with Warren's first speech. When this time in 1775, they recognized that things were going to be a little bit different. The British forces, Aaron writes, now stationed in the city, Samuel Adams noted, were likely to resent any insinuation that their actions had been barbaric and would surely, quote, take the occasion to beat up a breeze. In other words, they were just waiting for anything that could get them rolling. And there are some stories that a couple events may have happened, and in these articles, they'll discuss that here from Aaron Shalev, and also I have one from Selena B. Baker, which is really awesome, talking about how there were threats at Dr. Joseph Warren's life. They held out some bullets that said, hey, basically, we're going to blow you away. And then there was also supposedly orders to maybe arrest everyone, create a commotion, and then arrest Hancock and Adams, and also Warren. But that's not how it went down. You can read about that more if you want to understand kind of the hidden history. Anyways, here from Selena B. Baker, she said, if there was trouble, Samuel Adams wanted someone of Joseph's experience and resolve in the pulpit. So they were very concerned that there might be a problem. The British were going to be there in attendance at this commemoration of an attack by the British regulars. And so this could well be the last time General Gage would allow patriots to freely assemble in Boston. They wanted a man with some resolves. And the British regulars present were going to resent an oration whose purpose was, as Samuel Adams described it in a letter to Richard Henry Lee, to commemorate a massacre perpetuated by soldiers and to show the danger of standing armies. That was the primary goal of this, the danger of standing armies, according to Samuel Adams, who, of course, was very close with Dr. Joseph Warren. Now, here, Selena Baker described the scene. She said, a crowd of 5,000 people gathered at the Old South Meeting House. Some were British officers. That's, I think, a little bit of an understatement. Samuel Adams invited them to sit in the pews directly in the front of the pulpit so they might, quote, have no pretense to behave ill. He wanted them kind of with their backs to the crowd, I think. That's a pretty smart strategist. If anything, Samuel Adams knew what was up. This put the soldiers uncomfortably close to the many leading patriots in the audience. Smart move. The officers were not only sitting in the pews, some, it is said, may have been seated on the steps leading up to the pulpit. We don't really have pictures of it. Here from Tom Malone in the Objective Standard, he said, because of the immense crowds and the British troops outside the building, Joseph Warren entered the pulpit by climbing a ladder and going through the window behind it. So he actually couldn't even walk through the church to get up to the front. That's a pretty grand entrance. The man, of course, did some theater and he understood these. Maybe it was on purpose. Dozens of British soldiers watched the scene menacingly. One even displayed bullets in his palm as a warning to Warren. Supposedly, someone right in the front held up some bullets basically saying, we're going to shoot you. And Warren, the theatrical expert, supposedly, this is kind of, we don't know for sure if this happened, supposedly just took a handkerchief and dropped over it and basically saying, I ignore you. Your threats mean nothing. And that's how Tom Malone put it. He said, the doctor was not intimidated. He delivered a passionate address that provided conceptual fuel for the impending War for Independence revolution. Warren's speech was delivered 2 weeks before Patrick Henry's more famous Liberty or Death speech in Virginia. And this is the same kind of message. We can look to people like Patrick Henry, who lived through the War for Independence, and Dr. Joseph Warren, who did not, with the very, very same kind of message. Now, I've seen where a Governor Hutchison had at one point written that there were about 300 officers in attendance. That's a pretty large number, although it was about 5,000 there. So maybe a little under 10% of the crowd, but hundreds, they say dozens here, potentially up to 300 people in attendance. I've got an image here of the pulpit. This is going to be linked to in the show notes as well. There'll be a link to this over at Selena B. Baker Author, her WordPress site. She does some really great stuff over there. You should also follow her on X as well. But you can see how there's this window behind the pulpit, and if he climbed in, that was pretty dramatic. Now, Warren really had the very same message. Do not be intimidated. And here from his Massacre Day oration of March 6, 1775, this, I think, a lot of the messages we can really think about in a very similar way today, because we also live under the largest empire, the largest, most powerful government in the history of the world. And I think there's a long way to go before we have a population that's on board with this kind of message, but the message has a lot of truth for today as well. And Warren said, our country is in danger, but not to be despaired of. Our enemies are numerous and powerful, but we have many friends. determining to be free, and heaven and earth will aid the resolution. On you depend the fortunes of America. You are to decide the important question on which rests the happiness and liberty of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourself. So he's saying this is a momentous time in history, and millions yet unborn. This is very similar to what Samuel Adams had written in 1771. All might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. We can see how the Sons of Liberty in Boston had very similar rhetoric. But the liberty and freedom of people yet unborn, millions, rely upon your actions today. Don't be intimidated. And that's how Aaron described it. He said Warren would not be intimidated. In fact, if contemporary accounts are correct, his chosen attire, what he actually wore, this is fascinating to me. As I've read over this over the years, this is just blows my mind. The plain white Roman toga. So supposedly around 11 in the morning, he went to this little shop across the street and changed from his regular outfit, whatever it would have been at the time, and changed into a toga. That must have been kind of weird, but the people understood Roman history and the symbolism behind this much more than people do today. So they understood what was going on. He wore a plain white Roman toga and established a dramatic contrast between the speaker and his redcoat antagonist. We know at Harvard that Warren had performed in the play Cato, and he understood that this was what the citizens of Rome wore to distinguish themselves, to differentiate themselves between professional soldiers and then also slaves. So you are a free person if you're wearing a toga. And so this day, he was basically showing the British, the citizens were going to be unintimidated. They were not going to be pushed around by Caesar, the new Caesar's tyrannical threats. And Aaron describes it like this. It was almost as if Warren knew they would be there, the British, and chose the garment precisely to antagonize them. As they sat stiffly in their heavy red wool coats, the sartorial definition of Britishness, he would hold forth in the flowing freedom of his billowing white garment, the sartorial definition of ancient primordial virtue. I just thought that was an interesting point. And then, of course, as he did in his 1772 speech, he really kicks it off with a natural rights view. This was the view, our rights come from our Creator. We do not get our rights as a gift from government. And he opened with that voluntary association and natural rights. Pretty fascinating stuff and pretty hardcore, especially for the time. That personal freedom, he said, is the natural right of every man. And that property or an exclusive right to dispose of what he has honestly acquired by his own labor necessarily arises therefrom, are truths which common sense has placed beyond the reach of contradiction. Again, so this is a very important truth for today, but the population at large is so far from this type of perspective, that our rights come from our Creator, that natural rights and personal freedom, this is what our birthright, and we also have exclusive property rights in what we earn. So this is not a mentality that a vast majority of people have today, but this was widely accepted by many people in Boston, at least at the time, Virginia as well. And he said, and no man or body of men can, without being guilty of flagrant injustice, claim a right to dispose of the persons or acquisitions of any other man or body of men, unless it can be proved that such a right has arisen from some compact between the parties in which it has been explicitly and freely granted. Halfway there. I mean, he's getting there. It's a really interesting approach. And then he went into kind of because he's talking about how the only way you can claim this type of power is if you have proof that we've agreed to it. And he then goes through some history of the early settlement there in Boston and Massachusetts, which was intended, Aaron writes, to determine this is how Warren put it, determine with what degree of justice the late Parliament of Great Britain has assumed the power of giving away that property which the Americans have earned by their labor. So by working with the soil, by working in shops, by creating and building things, what they earned was their own. And Parliament had no right to take even a portion of it. That was a very, very strong mentality at the time. It doesn't exist. It's almost non-existent today. Of course, us here, we are on board with that type of thing. Aaron writes that Warren portrayed a Manichaean, so like a worldview of basically everything is good or evil, very black and white. He had a worldview in which, quote, the tools of power in every age, confronted the benign power of liberty, embodied in his case by the Puritan forefathers. And here's how he described it. He went into some history. He said, "Our fathers, having nobly resolved never to wear the yoke of despotism, and seeing the European world at the time through indolence and cowardice, falling a prey to tyrannies," basically saying if you fall to tyranny, this is indolence and being cowards, because if they are coming for you and you don't stand up for it and liberty is the top goal, then, well, you're a coward. This is a pretty strong push. Samuel Adams, again, in 1771, in that great essay that he wrote as Candidus in the Boston Gazette on October 14th, he basically said, "I have no pity on anyone who won't take a stand. They deserve what they get, in essence." And he said, "I know that's kind of harsh to say, but that was the attitude that they have. They fell prey to a tyranny. They bravely threw themselves upon the bosom of the ocean." So they escaped that and came across the ocean, determined to find a place in which they might enjoy their freedom or perish in the glorious attempt. They were willing to actually go. That was a dangerous trip. Very, very dangerous trip. They knew that, well, they didn't know what they were in for. And once people got there was no way to really communicate. You couldn't text someone and say, "Hey, dude, it's pretty rough here. You might want to hold off for a while." He said, "But savages and death with torture were far less terrible than slavery. If you couldn't have free choice in religion and in conscience, then of course that was kind of a state of slavery. Someone else was controlling your thoughts, your actions, your earnings as well. Of course, we're talking property rights as well. And to the founding generation, that was to be owned by someone else. And they were willing to actually brave those potential dangers rather than give up their freedom." And he's encouraging the people again to do the same. It's kind of a backbone that humanity seems to have lost. Nothing was so much the object of their abhorrence as a tyrant's power. They knew that it was more safe to dwell with man in his most unpolished state than in a country where arbitrary power prevails. Arbitrary power is power on a whim. Basically, the people with power determine how much power they get, and they change their minds, and then it's up to them. And arbitrary power was listed as one of the so-called grievances, the injuries and usurpations in the Declaration of Independence. Going further, he said, "But tyranny, when once established, entails its curses on a nation to the latest period of time, unless some daring genius, inspired by heaven, shall unappalled danger bravely form and execute the arduous design of restoring liberty and life to his enslaved, murdered country." In other words, once they've stolen your freedom, or you've allowed them to take it, not stood up for it, it's going to take, well, a lot of courage to really get back to it. Here again, from Tom Malone, he said he noted that the settlers had gained possession of their land through negotiating with the natives, as well as through their sweat equity in turning, this is like a homesteading mentality. It's very, very libertarian. Sweat equity in turning a wilderness into a habitable civilization, not from a grant by the king. And he pointed out that Britain became interested in the colony only after settlers had done all the hard work in establishing it. So yeah, their toil and blood. He said, but when at an infinite expense of toil and blood, people gave up quite a bit to establish a place where they could live free, much simpler lives, but at least they were able to have freedom. This widely extended continent had been cultivated and defended when the hardy adventurers justly expected that they and their descendants should peaceably have enjoyed the harvest of those fields which they had sown and the fruit of those vineyards which they had planted. This country was then thought worthy of the attention of the British ministry. Oh, yes, like you guys do all the work. We don't care about that. You guys are crazy to even try. And then suddenly things start going well. And all of a sudden the government people start saying, hey, we want in on that. And that's Tom kind of gets into that a little bit as well. Tom Malone over at the Objective Standard. He said Warren then went on to show that the conflict was caused by Britain's change of policy from one of benign neglect to one of taxation without representation. All of a sudden, this is a rich land and they're doing pretty well. Not everyone's just starving to death in their whatever socialist experiment garbage that they had maybe tried right off the bat. Maybe that's not what they're thinking. That's my kind of little hyperbole, but whatever, So things start working well. They want to get their dirty little hands into everything, just like government people always do. And they claim it's for your protection. And then all of a sudden they changed it. This was a policy that changed, Tom writes, the British-American relationship from one of equal and independent citizens to that of master and slave. And that's how Joseph Warren described it. Quote, some demon in an evil hour suggested to a short-sighted financier the hateful product of transferring the whole property of the king's subjects in America to his subjects in Britain. How many times have you heard things like, if you don't want the government to have power over this, or this, you hate this group, you hate America, you hate freedom, you hate whatever, or you're dangerous. And it's totally opposite to Joseph Warren. It's like the evil people are the ones and the hateful people are the ones who want to rip you off and take stuff and transfer it to the people in power. So anyways, back to Joseph Warren. He said, the claim of the British Parliament to tax the colonies can never be supported by such a transfer. So they're basically transferring power, transferring wealth, transferring property from the people who had toiled, sweat and blood to earn it, and to other people. For the right of the House of Commons of Great Britain to originate any tax or grant money is altogether derived from their being elected by the people of Great Britain to act for them. So this is primarily a taxation without representation argument there as well. Like, if this is even going to happen, we're going to make our own decisions locally. It's kind of a precursor to the 10th Amendment. Not saying that in all situations, this is not an anarcho-capitalist or pure taxationist theft mentality. It's just like, if there's going to be this kind of stuff, a far-off government is the wrong place to do it. He said, every attempt of theirs or of those whom they have deputed to act for them, to give or grant any part of our property is any part, even the smallest amount, is directly repugnant to every principle of reason and natural justice. And of course, we know that part of the issue was then enforcing this type of thing through, well, when they didn't comply, then they started tightening the screws. We have what many people today call the intolerable acts. They were really the coercive acts, basically addressing Massachusetts, Boston. It led to the siege in 1775. He said, when the measures of administration had disgusted the colonies to the highest degree, and the people of Great Britain had by artifice and falsehood been irritated against America, an army was sent over to enforce submission to certain acts of the British Parliament, which reason scored to countenance, and which placemen and pensioners were found unable to support. So people who didn't have much money either were also getting pretty screwed over. And then, of course, what did the British do? They sent armies to enforce their will. They thought the people were too uppity and they had to be put down. And this is where they were finding themselves once again in 1775. He said, martial law and the government of a well-regulated city are so entirely different that it has always, this was not considered a new thing. This was from a long understanding in both American and British history, and I've covered this in other episodes. I should have had this one handy, but this was a widely understood maxim that standing armies were always dangerous. And here was a man of a man willing to fight, unlike most anyone alive today. We'll get to that near the end of the show. Martial law and the government of a well-regulated city are so entirely different that it has always been considered as improper to quarter troops in populous cities. Frequent disputes must necessarily arise between the citizen and the soldier, even if no previous animosities subsist. And he said, and it is further certain from a consideration of the nature of mankind, as well as from constant experience, that standing armies always endanger the liberty of the subject. It's not sometimes. It's not once in a while. It's not only in emergencies or extreme cases. It's not just over there. It's not just dictators. It's literally in every situation. Here's the war hero telling us that standing armies always endanger the liberty of the subject. And here from Selena B. Baker, she writes, when Joseph spoke of the events of March 5th, 1770, because then he now transitions to a little history, because this is a commemoration of the massacre. It's not just pointing out the problems that they face, but it's commemorating the massacre and recognizing that if they don't do something, it's probably going to happen again. They can't just let it go for those millions yet born. He said, She said, instead of dwelling on the brutality of the soldiers, he focused on the agony and despair of the families who had lost loved ones that night. And she writes, and she's a great writer, she writes a short half-paragraph story about the passage of his own father, maybe saying that, there's a guy who had done some acting. Maybe he was drawing on that own experience, but it was considered very powerful. John Adams once wrote in his diary that basically all these early, especially these early Massacre Day orations, no one ever left one of these events with a dry eye. And basically it was bringing people to tears. He said, the many injuries offered to the town, this is Joseph Warren, I pass over in silence. I cannot now mark out the path which led to that unequaled scene of horror, the sad remembrance of which takes the full possession of my soul. The baleful images of terror crowd around me, and discontented ghosts with hollow groans appear to solemnize the anniversary of the 5th of March. And he said, come, widowed mourner, here satiate thy grief, calling on the people to remember the pain of what they went through. Behold thy murdered husband. Again, point out this was a murder. Gasping on the ground, and to complete the pompous show of wretchedness, bring in each hand thy infant children to bewail their father's fate. Take heed, ye orphan babes, lest, while your streaming eyes are fixed upon the ghastly corpse, your feet glide on the stones, be spattered with your father's brains. He's not holding back. He's using some pretty powerful imagery, and people are there to commemorate the dangers of a standing army killing people, and there's the standing army literally there in attendance, a show of force, threatening more violence as well. Enough, he said. This tragedy need not be heightened by an infant weltering in the blood of him that gave it birth. So, man, this is pretty powerful stuff. But even in the face of this, he was still urging people to use restraint and peace because this was their approach. He said, but stop, my bold, adventurous countrymen, stain not your weapons with the blood of Britons. No revenge. Revenge is below a good people. We do not act out of revenge. Now leave us alone. He said, revenge is far beneath the noble mind. The storm subsides, a solemn pause ensues. You spare upon condition they depart. So it is, get out, leave us alone. Bygones, let bygones be bygones. This is 5 years now. We will let it go. Leave us alone. And if not, we're not going to leave you alone either. They go, he said. They quit your city. They no more shall give offense. This closes the important drama. So he urged them to basically hold back. But despite all this, he's saying, look, we're offering peace over and over and over. Just let us be. Yet we still have troops in our streets once again. He said, our streets are again filled with armed men. Our harbor is crowded with ships of war, but these cannot intimidate us. Right? We have to defend us, as I said right at the beginning, defend liberty against friends as well as enemies. He said, the man who meanly will submit to wear a shackle contemns the noblest gift of heaven and impiously affronts the God that made him free. So if you stand here and let them do what they are doing, take our property, use a military force to shut down our port, to suspend our legislature, to really just to be this strong presence threatening violence at us at every single turn possible. This is someone who is showing contempt for the gift of rights that we got from our Creator, affronts the God that made him free. He said, perhaps, all gracious heaven avert it, perhaps the power of Britain, a nation great in war, by some malignant influence may be employed to enslave you, but let not even this discourage you. So here we are. He's like, look, it doesn't matter how powerful these people are. They may be the strongest government in the history of the world. They have used their military to instill fear and violence against all kinds of peoples all over the place, but don't let that intimidate you. When you are on the right side, you do what's right, whether the odds are stacked against you or not. But he does lean in on some silver linings. He talked about how taxation without representation, of course, this is a bad thing. He was talking about that. But he said it has excited an almost universal inquiry into the rights of mankind in general. Because they're doing this stuff, now all of a sudden all kinds of people are writing about natural rights and property rights. and looking at it and understanding it better and better. He said the Boston Port Bill brought support from other colonies and even some in Europe. And then he said the mutilation, so suspending the legislature in Massachusetts, he said the mutilation of our charter has made every other colony jealous for its own. So basically, like the more that they attack us, the more that we can get support from others. So let's at least look at it in a positive light, even with all this negativity. And he said, even the sending of troops to put these acts into execution is not without advantages to us. The exactness and beauty of their discipline inspire our youth with ardor in the pursuit of military knowledge. Charles the Invincible taught Peter the Great the art of war. The Battle of Pultowa convinced Charles of the proficiency Peter had made. So, you learn from the bad guys and then you become better at than the bad guys and get rid of them. And it kind of create, maybe a cycle. He said, but pardon me, my fellow citizens, I know you want not zeal or fortitude. You will maintain your rights or perish in the generous struggle. Liberty or death again. However difficult to combat, you will never decline it when freedom is the prize, because freedom is the prize. And again, to Selina B. Baker, she said, at this point, Joseph launched into a passage. We're not certain if Warren actually wrote this passage, but we can see from the original notes, and there's, crossing out and circling and adding of stuff, that this one was likely added at the last minute, in which he insisted, quote, an independence of Great Britain is not our aim. He's basically saying, look, our number one goal is not to break away. We're happy being in this, I guess we can call it confederation as part of the empire. Benjamin Franklin talked about this as well. Just back off, leave us alone. And we're happy to be brothers and sisters. But if you're going to keep insisting on this type of unlimited power over us, then of course we're going to have no other option. An independence of Great Britain is not our aim. And he went on to caution that if measures to do so are ineffectual, and it appears that the only way to safety is through fields of blood, I know you will not turn your faces from your foes, and you will undauntedly press forward until liberty is trodden underfoot, and you have fixed your adored goddess liberty fast by a Brunswick side on the American throne. Again, we're talking about liberty being the goal, even if it was under the threat of violence. You had to actually take a stand. Now, just weeks later, as he's saying, you're not going to back down. You're not going to, even if it's like fields of blood, you will take a stand against the standing army. But he was the guy who sent Paul Revere and I believe two others out on their midnight rides to warn that the British were coming. So he was the guy who said, okay, Paul Revere, the British are coming, get out there. I mean, that's a version of the story. But he was the one who sent Revere, Hawes, and I think a third one that we don't know the name of. But on the very next day, he himself, this was something that Joseph Warren did. Not all the Patriot leaders did this type of thing, but he personally went to fight alongside the local militia, and he was attacking the British troops personally. He was one of the lead guys hitting their rear over and over and over as they retreated from Concord to Boston. And from what I've read, he was actually almost killed that day. A bullet basically hit his hat or something like that. It was very close to killing him that day because he was just in the front at all times. He had this view that if he was going to be a leader, he had to show other people how to be courageous by being courageous himself. And Selina Baker actually points this out in her great article, but I've seen this elsewhere as well. And we don't know for sure if this is what it was because it wasn't actually reported that this was said until a couple of decades later from a family member, but he supposedly said to his mother, I will either see my country free or shed my last drop of blood to make her so. And whether he said that or not in those exact phrases, we know that's exactly the approach that Joseph Warren took. And tragically, Joseph Warren himself, as Tom Malone puts it here, would die in a field of blood just 3 months later. Warren borrowed when other people were in the Continental Congress, but what he did when there was a battle going on, he went and grabbed a musket, borrowed one, headed to Bunker Hill and to what would be the Battle of Bunker Hill. Although he had been appointed a major general by the Massachusetts Provincial Congress just 3 days earlier, he left the command to someone else, General Israel Putnam and Colonel William Prescott, and insisted on fighting with the volunteers in the fiercest part of the battle. He was always that guy He was willing to stick his neck out and do what he was talking about. If he's saying we are going to stand up and fight for our freedom, he was not going to be just urging other people to do that. I mean, we all got to take a little something to learn and improve upon personally. He knew his fellow patriots were vastly outnumbered and wanted to encourage them with his example. He fought alongside them until he was out of ammunition. And though the Patriots inflicted heavy casualties on the British, they were outnumbered 2-1 and ultimately had to retreat. And as he's out of ammunition, and during this retreat, Warren was actually recognized supposedly by a British officer, and then he was struck and killed by a musket ball to his head. I think he was killed probably instantly. But the scene was, if you've seen some of these old American Revolutionary pictures, I've got the image up here. He was basically immortalized in Jonathan Trumbull's painting. I think it was called The Death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker's Hill, 17 June, 1775. And from what I've read, I think this is another one of these rumors, but General Gage supposedly said that Warren's death was equal to 500 ordinary colonists. So, man, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. I hope it encourages you to read and learn more. Alan Mosley, as I mentioned, will get this blog post organized with all the reference links that I'm talking about here, all the original source, Joseph Warren's speech, plus the articles that I'm referencing, the other episodes I've done on other Massacre Day orations from Church, Warren as well, and John Hancock. I like the John Hancock one a lot too, but Joseph Warren is kind of very close to my heart with his type of courage, something that I would like to strive for myself. But anyways, if you want to help us get this kind of information out to more and more people, nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. And I really appreciate any consideration you can give to joining us today. And I do want to say a quick hello and a huge thank you to just a handful of people who have joined us lately. There's Leon in New Mexico, Andrea in North Carolina, Larry here in California, Susan in Vermont, and Benjamin in Arizona. I'm so grateful for your support, whether it's $2 a month or $2 zillion a month. I mean, they keep depreciating the value, but we will use it, as we always do, to punch way above our weight class and stand for the Constitution and liberty, whether the government likes it or not. We know they don't. Anyways, I'll take a look over in the live chat. I see some normal names and a few new people. There's, of course, Kirk and Haji, Melody, Sonny, James Myers, Senator DT, and a few others. I'm going to look over in the chat a little bit later today and tomorrow. I'll get a lot of great feedback, a lot of great suggestions for future episodes, and I really appreciate all your comments and questions. Make sure to also consider smashing the like, leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform. Comments, subscribing, notifications, all that stuff can help trigger algorithms. And, it tells them to show us to more people, and I really appreciate your help and support. Anyways, again, I really appreciate you being here with me today. I hope you had an awesome weekend. I hope your Monday's off to a good start, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.